Hi class, in this video we'll go over the chapters on inflation and money. So this is a really important chapter because I would say 90% of all the information coming from after this chapter is all based on this one. So make sure to pay special attention. Okay. All right. So let's get. We're going to talk about inflation and money. First, let's talk about what is. So inflation by definition is whenever you have an increase in the average prices, that's called inflation. So it pretty much means everything getting more expensive. But the key word here is that's average, right? So even though in inflation you might see overall price level increase, but you can still see some certain items getting cheaper. So think about, let's say, U.S. economy in the last 40 years, we saw really high increase in the price level of almost everything, but there's still something getting cheaper. So for example, the price of movie ticket has been getting cheaper for the last 10 years. The price of I don't know, digital items have been getting cheaper too, right? Computers. So those individual items getting cheaper, even though overall the average price is still increasing. So that's called inflation. So you have an increase in the overall level of price item, but everything. So the thing we'll talk about today is going to be called consumer price index. So consumer price index is what we use in America to measure this inflation. There is an agency in the U.S. government. It's called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you get interested, go to bls.gov. So where's my pen? So bls.gov. That's the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. That will show you the price level of almost every single item in the economy. And you can go back as far as 1935. So really a very comprehensive collection of the inflation information in the economy. So this CPI by definition is an index. So it's a collection of different tracks, the average prices consumers pay from time to time over a basket of goods and services. So CPI doesn't just measure one or two things, it really measures the overall spending behavior by the consumers. So a basket of different goods and services all in the CPI. So imagine you can look for the CPI of let's say I don't know, entertainment consumers spend money on, right? So that can be movie ticket, music, games, TVs. So all those together, they're part of entertainment, and that's going to be measured by the CPI, so Consumer Price Index. Okay, so let's look at the CPI. We use CPI to measure inflation, and inflation, the formula for that, we're going to use our CPI or the price level for this year minus last year divided by last year times 100. Now this is missing 100%. So the reason why times 100, we're going to turn this decimal into a percentage because inflation is a percentage measurement, not a decimal. So inflation rate, again, is for this year's CPI minus last year's CPI, and then divided by last year's CPI. Actual CPI in the economy, think about everything that our consumers spend money on. For US consumers, the biggest spending category is housing, right? So rent, remodeling, utilities, those would be all part of housing over here. So for a typical consumer, we spend about 43% of our overall spending on housing. And then the next biggest item will be your food and also transportations. Those two categories depends on different states. They might have different ranking. So places like Texas, Texas want to spend more money on transportation, less money on food because food is cheaper. But imagine, let's say you live in New York. So New York, you're probably going to spend more on food and less on transportation because most people take public transportation to go to work, right? So, but regardlessly, for the entire country, the top three items, number one, housing, and depends on where you are, either transportation or food can be number 2 and 3. To measure our CPI, let me go back one more slide. So to measure CPI, the first step we saw was to look at what is included in the basket. So define the basket, know what's in it, and then second step is to find out all the prices in the basket. So for every single item of good in the basket, how much are they from time to time to time? So tracking prices. I mean, it feels very much like whenever you go to a grocery store, so you get a little basket, put all the stuff you have. That's step number one. Step number 2 is to know how much are the cost of each item in your basket. The price of milk, the price of eggs, the price for vegetables. And then step 3, we're going to add up all the services, all the good, all the prices together. So to see that for the entire basket, how much is the total cost of the basket? That's our CPI. And last step, we're going to use CPI, this basket cost, to find out what is our inflation rate. So again, with this formula we saw before, so using your CPI for this year, so basket for this year, minus basket for last year, and divided by the basket value for last year, and times 100%. So this year minus last year, divided by last year, times 100%. Okay, so if you look at our inflation, by the way, this number was only accurate as of the year 2000s. So before pandemic, we saw very low inflation, but since pandemic, we're seeing very high inflation now. So the latest inflation from last year was about 9%. So 9%, that was almost as high as 1980 level, right? So inflation has been pretty bad for the last couple of years now. It is getting better, but we still haven't get down to the pre-pandemic level yet. All right, so next, so let's do some practice. Let's calculate our inflation using the basket value. So suppose we have a Max American dog. Okay, Max. This is Max annual consumption. So for the entire year, Max will purchase 730 cans of dog food, 6 bags of kibble. What's kibble? That's dog food, right? I don't know. I haven't owned a dog for many years. two vet visits and 2 chew toys. So this is the basket for this dog over here. And so that's our first step, to know what's in the basket. And then second step, know what are the prices of each item for the basket. Now, since we are doing this as a comparison to show inflation, so we're looking for the prices for this same basket in two different years, 2018 and 2019, and that's the price of each item in the basket. And then step number 3, we're going to total up the entire cost of the basket. So take the price, multiply by the quantity, and that will give you the total value here. And then at the end, add up everything all together, the total value for everything all together, and that is our basket value. So the last step, step number 4, to find inflation, we're going to take our 2019 basket value minus 2018 basket value divided by 2018 basket value. So the formula is actually very simple. It just says new minus old divided by old. Right? So step number 2019 minus 2018 divided by 2018 times 100, and that will give you 3.2% inflation. Okay, so step 1, 2, 3, 4 will go from the basket all the way to your inflation information. So that's how to do inflation using CPI. Okay, so you're going to see a question like this on your quiz, so be very careful with the calculation, because if you make one mistake, everything after that is all wrong. Okay, so definitely try to use Excel more often, try to keep track of all your calculation. That way, if there is a mistake, you can always go back to fix it. Okay. CPI is not perfect. There are some things CPI cannot measure. Number 1, that every time if you have a change in quality, CPI cannot measure that. Right? So sometimes consumers are paying higher prices, but simply because we're buying something that's a better in quality. That's why it's more expensive. But CPI still believe that, hey, you're paying something more, there must be inflation, right? So CPI ignores the change in quality. Second, CPI really couldn't keep up with any introduction of new good. So imagine the question we just did before for the Max the dog. Imagine 2019, there's a new kind of dog food came out that Max start consuming. Well, if you try to compare to 2018, when that food wasn't available, it's hard to compare the difference in cost. So every time there's a new good introduced, then that will throw off CPI. And the number 3 is also known as substitution bias. That means consumers will change behavior, but CPI doesn't care. So think about, let's say, I don't know, like you guys, right? So you go to HEB, you want to buy some groceries. Let's suppose every week you buy a mixture of broccolis and lettuce. And I suppose you can do either one, they're both vegetables. But if the price for broccoli decreases, according to law of demand, lower price on broccoli, we're going to consume more lettuce, so the purchase for lettuce goes up. And vice versa, if the broccoli getting cheaper, we're going to buy more broccoli, and then therefore purchase less lettuce. So consumer will change behavior whenever the relative price between lettuce and broccoli changes. But CPI says we don't care. We still assume the consumer buy the same amount of good regardlessly how the price changes. So that's called a substitution bias, right? So CPI couldn't measure any behavior change in the consumers. Okay, so these three reasons why CPI is not always the best measurement to see how good the inflation is. There are a couple of different type of measurement that our government uses. So for sure, we talked about this before, the CPI is the most widely used measurement for inflation. Most of the, imagine our government benefits such as Social Security, that's based off CPI. For many of the long-term projects government sign off on, that's also based off CPI. So CPI is also widely used in the business. So many companies also use CPI to measure how much the inflation is. But different government agencies have different measurements. For monetary policies, this use something called a personal consumption expenditure deflator. We're going to talk more about this in the later chapter. What is a monetary policy? So think this way, that on the bigger picture, for bigger government policies that goes down to our banks, our money, our interest rate, that's usually decided by this PEC deflator, or personal consumption expenditure deflator. And another one to measure CPI is something we saw from the previous chapter. Remember we did the GDP deflator. That's also a way to measure our inflation. And then one more is called a core inflation. So the core inflation actually exclude the price changes in food and energy. And the reason why we exclude the food and energy, because those two items, they tend to be very seasonal and also very volatile. So imagine, let's suppose economy is doing great, everything's fine, but what if we have a winter storm in America, that all of a sudden, we couldn't transport our food to different places anymore. So let's say if you live in Denver, Colorado, right? So most of the food over there in the wintertime is all transported from Texas. But what if the winter storm, um, put a stop on it, and then all of a sudden there's a food shortage or vegetable shortage in Denver, and that causes a price increase. But that has nothing to do with our economics. It has to do with weather. And also that price will quickly fall down whenever the weather improves, right? So those kind of volatility in food and energy will tend to throw off our inflation. So to have a more accurate long-term inflation measurement, we ignore our food and energy prices in the core inflation measurement. Okay, so far I talked about four, right? So we talk about the CPI, which we just did in the beginning chapter, the personal consumption deflator, and also this one here, core inflation. The GDP deflator, that one is very rarely used, but it is a way to calculate our inflation too. Okay. If you compare the three measurements, the CPI, the core inflation, and also the PEC inflation, they goes in the same direction, but you do see that the blue line is our CPI. You see how the CPI is more volatile. It changes, has a more up and down compared to the other two lines. That's because CPI has everything in it, including our food and energy. But for the core inflation tend to be more stable, more steadily. So that actually exclude our food and energy prices. So one more measurement is called a producer price index. So the CPI measures all the consumption all the purchase by the consumers. But the PPI, the producer price index, measures all the prices paid by the producers. And the reason why we need to know that is that the consumer CPI is a very good way to show you what the current inflation is, because that shows you how much consumer pays. But if you find out what the PPI is, the producer price index, that will show you how much the future inflation will be. Because if companies are paying a higher price today, when they sell this good later on, they're going to be asking for a higher price too, right? So a current inflation that paid by the business will equals to more future inflation that will be paid by the consumers. So there is a connection between our PPI and the CPI, right? So current PPI will tend to equal to the future CPI. So the PPI is a good way to see how much our future inflation will be. Okay. All right. Let's continue. So next, let's talk about adjusting the effect of inflation. So how do we fix that? So we can use this CPI or inflation measurement to compare the monetary value from time to time. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose you're looking at what is the unemployment level or the unemployment wage. I'm sorry, the minimum wage. So for the minimum wage, right now it's $7.25 per hour. So it has been for a while now, and many people saying this is very, very low. But if you compare it to our minimum wage back in 1960s, when we first had a minimum wage back in 1960s, the minimum wage back then was only $1.25. So today at $7.25, it's much higher now. But also keep in mind, back then everything was cheaper, right? So you have to really adjust for what the price level back in 1960s to today's price level to see which minimum wage is higher. So that your today's dollar amount equals to a different time dollar amount times the price level today over the price level over time. Now this is not my favorite way to write it. So how I would write it, I would do like a cross multiply formula. So I'm gonna use imagine your dollar amount in year X. So that's your today's dollar divided by CPI in year X over the dollar amount in year Y divided by CPI in year Y. So still the same formula, I just move something around, and for me, this one is easier to remember, right? So put all the same time on each side of the equation. So dollar amount divided by CPI for each year, and then all you're gonna do is just solve for the missing variable. All right, I'm gonna skip this. So also know what the difference is between a real variable and a nominal variable. So real variable is measured in the dollar amount, right? So how much it is on the price check. That's your nominal variable. Real variable, that's your inflation adjusted measurement. So for example, if I say, hey, let's suppose Andy's monthly income, let's say $1,000, that's a nominal variable. But if I say, hey, Andy's income for the month, he can use the income to purchase 200 t-shirts, then that will be a real variable, right? So real variable really measures the stuff, the numbers, the amount of stuff you have. Nominal variable is the inflation built into the price level. Okay, so know the difference. All right, so other real variable you need to know, know about the real wage. We talked just use that for the example with Andy. Know about real wealth. So how much money you have doesn't matter. It's really how much stuff you have, right? So that's the real wealth. So if you own a car, if you own a house, that's a real wealth, right? But if you just have money, cash, that's a nominal wealth, right? So with inflation, your real wealth will stay constant. But with inflation, your nominal wealth would decrease in value. Okay, and lastly, what's the real revenue? So real revenue, you're gonna use as a comparison to compare with different staff, right? So different employee in the company. All right. So also know what's a nominal interest rate and what's a real interest rate. So nominal interest rate is the interest rate the bank pays you. So you go to the bank. Bank says, hey, deposit your money. We're gonna pay you a 25% interest rate on your deposit. That sounds very good. But also keep in mind there might be some inflation going on. That with inflation, you're gonna be worse off. Right? So what if your nominal interest rate, how much the bank pays you, is 25%, but inflation for the year is 50%? That means your money went up by 25%, but the price of everything else went up by 50%. So you are worse off. So the other measurement we need to see is going to be what is our real measurement or the real interest rate. So in this case here, that will be a minus 25%. Right? So this real interest rate, that's a real profit, Nominal interest rate, that's the interest rate the bank pays you on paper. All right, so next, let's kind of money illusions. All right, so money illusion is that whenever consumers or business base our decisions on the monetary value instead of the real value. So imagine if your boss says, hey, they're doing a very good job, that we're going to double your pay. Feel pretty good? Well, not yet, because you're going to think about, even though your pay is doubled, what about the inflation, right? So what if the price level for everything else increased by 200% or 300%, but your pay is only doubled? Then you are not better off, right? So think about last year, so 2022. So 2022, the average pay in America increased by 4.7%, which is very, very high. I mean, on a national level increased by 4.7% is very high. But the problem is that our inflation for last year was 9%, was twice the amount of the increase in wages. So most people are worse off because price level of or inflation increasing faster than how much their nominal pay is increasing. So if you only base your decisions on the nominal wage, that is called a money illusion. Okay, so all right, so next. All right, so we'll talk about this. Now that's the last part. Let's talk about what is money and then the cost of it. So money is any asset has a value on it that can be used in a transaction. That's called money. So there are three functions. They are medium of exchange, unit of account, and a store value. So medium of exchange means you can easily exchange money for something else, right? So you can take your money with you and use to buy something else. So think about this: your of course cash is money, but let's say diamonds. Diamond is easier to exchange. You can take it with you, but maybe an airplane is not a good medium of exchange anymore. You cannot take it with you anywhere you go. Okay, so next, to become money, this must be a very good unit of account. That means your money is precise enough to measure the value of something else. So we can say, hey, maybe one computer is equivalent to 1,000 marker. And those markers are now used to measure the value of a computer. So the marker, that's a unit of account. And lastly, store value means that you can save your money and then in the short term or long term, it still retains a similar value or even higher value. And that's called store value. So for anything to become money, it must satisfy these three criteria. Right, so also known as a hyperinflation. So inflation is whenever you have price level increases. Hyperinflation is whenever you have very, very high inflation. That's called hyperinflation. Now, we didn't put out any real numbers on how high the inflation has to be to become hyperinflation, but in most economic textbooks, the definition is either 200% inflation per year or 50% inflation per month. Either one are used interchangeably as definition for hyperinflation, but just know that hyperinflation means very, very high inflation. And if you guys want to look for some examples for that, think about country like Zimbabwe in 2008, Germany in the years before World War II. Those will be all example of hyperinflation. So price of everything is increasing very, very fast. So for Venezuela over here, the example here says, in July 2016, a cup of coffee costs 450 bolivar. That's still pretty expensive. But by 2018, it costs you $1 million bolivar, right? That's a huge increase in prices. And then in the picture, those are the monies the country have. So see how much money that is. But that's actually worthless because money is worthless in Venezuela. All right, so the problem for hyperinflation, so what kind of downside am I have? So for one, something called a manual cost. Because for manual cost, just imagine if I own a restaurant and there is an increase in price level every day. That means I gotta constantly changing my menu price. So I have to take my menu back to the printer and print a new menu for it. So there's a cost involved to adjust for higher price level, to adjust for inflation. and that's called manual cost. Now the shoe leather cost. So again, imagine price level is very high, and then I have to keep walking or running to the ATM to get more cash out. But in the process, I'm wearing out my shoes, right? My shoes are wearing faster. That's a shoe leather cost. So these two costs here are associated whenever you have high inflation in the economy. If there's an actual cost burden on the economy. And we're going to talk more about this unexpected inflation in the future, but know this, that whenever inflation is unexpected, that's when it's most effective. So there are ways for economy to use inflation as a tool to improve economic activities, and that only works when inflation is unexpected. But for now, don't worry about it. We're going to talk more about it in future chapters. And lastly, inflation fallacy that many people complain that when there's inflation, that would decrease the value of the money and therefore they're worse off. Well, that's not always the case because more than often, whenever price level increases, wage will increase along with it. So imagine the red line is our CPI, the blue line is our wage. So you see how the wage is also increasing on par with our inflation. So in most inflation situations, that even though it feels like we're worse off, but it's not by that much because more than likely that our wage will either increase or decrease along with it. Okay. All right, guys. So that's have any question, let me know, and I will see you for next chapter. All right, bye bye.